8:25 is the time on the clock on the bold voice, a clear sky in the capital city today, but it's beautiful, man. It's always beautiful. I love a good day. I absolutely do love a good day, and you might say it's easy to say that because I probably say that every day, but every day should be a good day, isn't it? Especially because it's a Friday. Sure, it's mid-month, but you can smile in the fact that in about a week or two, it's not going to be mid-month anymore. So you just have to hold on just a little bit. But it's good. It's always good to have a good day. And it's always good to smile in that regard. In any case, now ahead of the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Interphobia, and Transphobia, UNAIDS is urging governments worldwide to safeguard the human rights of LGBTQ plus individuals. That particular day is today, in actual fact. UNAIDS research highlights that protecting the human rights of every individual is crucial for public health as it ensures inclusive and equitable access to health services without discrimination. Significant strides, of course, have been made in the movement for universal human rights. For instance, at the onset of the AIDS pandemic, the majority of countries criminalized LGBTQ plus people. Today, two-thirds of countries no longer do so. Nevertheless, over 60 countries still criminalize LGBTQ plus individuals, and an additional 20 countries penalize gender expression and identity. So they're two sides to this coin, really. But to unpack this, we are joined this morning by human rights activist Linda Bauman, who's in studio. Friedel Dausab is on the line this morning, who has so far challenged the compatibility of the common law offense of sodomy and related offenses with his right under the Namibian constitution. Friedel, who joins us on the line this morning, a very good morning to you.
Good morning to you, sir, and good morning to all the listeners out there.
Thank you so much for making some time for us.
As well as to Linda.
Indeed. Thank you so much for making some time for us this morning. Linda Bauman, welcome back to the Desert Radio Studios. Always good to have you in studio.
Thank you, CJ.
Indeed. And Friedel, perhaps we'll start with you and maybe just a bit of education for the listeners that might not know out there. The International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Interphobia, and Transphobia that is today. Give us context on that, please.
So, the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Intersex phobia is really a day that highlights the othering, the stigma, the discrimination, and violence that people whose sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics may be different from the majority of our populations worldwide. We are talking about gay men, we are talking about lesbian women, we're talking about transgender men and women, and we're talking about intersex people across age, across race, across ability or disability, and nationality. And so this day really brings to the fore how LGBT people, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people are affected by laws, policies, social attitudes, as well as practices in our communities, especially in Namibia. This becomes really, really important because of the spate of violence which resulted in killings of people only because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And so I hope that Namibians can today take some time out to actually look at what is the experience of someone who's not like me. So let's celebrate today for the lives of LGBT people who are still alive, so that people can remain stigma and violence free in our society.
Linda Bauman, take us into the Namibian context. Do you think Namibians across the board will unify themselves in celebrating this day today and actually looking at this day today and like Friedel said, taking some time, considering where we are, and just having a deep thought about it?
I'd like to use the word commemoration.
Commemorate.
Because commemoration carries celebration, but also the pain. Because there's the realities that is currently experienced by LGBTI people in the country. As Friedel has scoped it out, I want to zoom in into the realities that we are experienced here, because we're talking about this, the individual who's the LGBT person, and we're talking about you as the general population of this country. So we're talking about a middle edge of a community that is marginalized by default of how a community looks or perceives them to be like. So yes, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and intersex phobia is a reality that we're experiencing, but there's also celebratory moments in this country. Sitting here with you on radio is a celebration. For me and Friedel to be able to speak and be able to nurture the pain and the gains that we have been moving through. The main call of this day is to actually say, let's take stock of where we are coming from and where we are heading as a country, but also as how we treat individuals in this country who do not seem to be fitting the norm. And I think a community like ours is initially celebrating this day, but also being continuously resilient, because we have to remain unapologetic for who we are, because nobody who identifies the LGBTI has asked to be as such. And nobody would ever ask for any form of being a target of discrimination. So we are calling upon the ally, the family, the LGBT person to harmonize and start that dialogue on this day and continue to be able to make and create an enabling environment. And that's the call to action basically for us in this country as Namibia, because life is rife out there. The realities of hate speech has just become a greater problem of existence, and that is what manifests homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia.
Friedel, let's take stock, as Linda said. How far have we come as Namibia? How before we get to where we're going to, how far have we come as a country in the fight, at the very least, against discrimination? There's so many things attached to that, but in the fight against discrimination of LGBTQI plus people.
Well, I would say not far in 30 years. I'm not so young, and so I can share with the listeners that I was a teenager and a high school student, actually just graduating from high school in 1991.
You're revealing your age, Friedel.
And so in any case, that really allows me to have a fair view of the liberation struggle, the fruits of which we were all supposed to enjoy, to today, where some Namibians feel they can actually go out there and kill someone just because they don't like them, just because they don't want to share a world with them, just because their feelings are hurt. I think in many, many ways, the only progress that we were able to make over the last 30 odd years was in the field of health. And as you rightly pointed out in the beginning of the show, the HIV epidemic has been a wake-up call, not just for Namibia, but for the rest of humanity, about the effects of discrimination. We know, of course, now why the rate of HIV among gay men, for example, is quite staggering. It is because people have to hide, they have to hide their sexuality, but also because of social discrimination at service points. And so over the last 30 years, as a young man who got HIV at the age of 25 in the year 2000, I always joke and say that I got the Y2K back, not the computers. But as a young man, this has really been one of the fights that I've had all over my life. And now we know that we can provide services to transgender folk. We can provide services, health services, that is, without impediment and discrimination on paper, because the ministry and government of Namibia have recognized that you cannot leave minority populations behind. in the fight to HIV. But now we are really at a point where we have to talk about general safety and security for each Namibian, including lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex persons. We are lucky in Namibia that we are standing on solid ground of a really good constitution that protects human rights. And in Chapter 3 of our constitution, human rights of all Namibians, including the human rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people, are entrenched. That means that neither the executive, the president and his ministerial team, or Parliament, National Assembly and National Council, or the courts can overturn the provisions that have been promised on our constitution. I think we have a long way to go. We have seen last year how our parliamentarians, instead of becoming protectors of our constitution on an oath that they had taken, became oath breakers. We have seen the vile language that were used by our elected leaders. And we can see the direct link of that vile, dehumanizing language without any fact and based on stereotype has led to some given courage to homophobes and biphobes and transphobes to go out and do killings. To date, we've had transgender women being killed. We've had gay men being killed. And the last one was really so gruesome. You have to really not see someone as a human being or as a person to do what the last killing did. So we have a long way to go. I think this is a wake-up call for the nation. It is a wake-up call for everyone in our nation that this is not my issue. Is it not your issue when another Namibian cannot walk on the streets safely or cannot enjoy the fruits of our independence? I have to unfortunately say that we haven't gone a long way when you take our constitution as a yardstick to see whether all Namibians are able to enjoy the promises made in our constitution.
8:38 is the time on the clock. In conversation with Linda Bauman and Friedel Dowsap this morning, we are speaking of the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Interphobia, and Transphobia. Linda, on the backdrop of what Friedel had to say, and still on taking stock, right? How do you deal with the reality that there is a large cohort of Namibians? We've seen them in Parliament and we've seen them on the streets and social media as well, that are very homophobic, and chances are very high that they're not going to change.
So let me add on that stock taking process. There's a reality that Namibia as a country internationally has never, for instance, demonstrated that they are homophobic or positioning themselves around the issue around LGBT. They've always been diplomatic in response, but also positioning itself that that's a national dialogue that should take place. That has been at the Universal Periodic Review process, but also at the African Commission. So that clearly indicates to you about the level of positioning over the years that Namibia has had, even though there's been country rhetorics around it. Now, if you look at the realities that Friedel flagged around the hate crimes that have brought out this reality, there is a very distinct position that Namibia has been having, which is diplomacy at a particular level. But we've also seen great strength in this country and growth, where we've seen this very same government that has actually got the Law Reform Commission to do a review of repealing the sodomy law. That's progress from an angle of a human rights basis. There has been progress for me also around human rights, as much as the only policy framework that is inclusive, that is the National Strategic framework that Friedel is talking about, has been enabling space. I don't even think the very same members of parliament remember that they have committed and pledged to get these programming and services equally to rich people. The same goes around human rights that has also advanced in this country, because the Ombudsman's office, starting from former ombudsman's bins into John Walters and so forth, there has been human rights progress in this country. Where there hasn't been progress, it's the political areas of this country where we're looking at political parties. Political parties have gradually tried having this conversation, engaging us, but they are the crust. And again, this very year, with all the hate crimes, all the hate speeches that has been inflicted by leaders in this country, because if you look at the rhetoric around the leadership that is bringing out positioning around LGBT issues, this is the reality of how the past 5 years have been. We've been coexisting. It's election year too. They have to manifest the reality that there is a majority that is not pro, but also the historic moments that the LGBTI movement has made in this country around using the judicial system is what actually irks the anti-LGBTI groups. That is why groups from sectors such as the religious groups, we've seen traditional authorities speak out, have been raging. But until today, there is no grounds, proper grounds around how they can justify morals and values over principles of the Constitution that is framed around human rights, democracy, but also advancing justice for all within an equal and an equal way, but also ensuring that equity is attained. Namibians are not that homophobic. When the incitement and positioning comes, that is how there's a cultivation of sectors that are trying to erupt and disrupt a process of growth, but also a process of dialogue. Because in this country, there's a lot of conversation that is happening with this very same government. And I think with the private members bill itself, that got us to get an indication on how National Assembly and National Council leaders are thinking. They are not in touch with their people. Are they saying that the people that has voted for them do not belong to this particular group that is the LGBTI community?
Isn't that scary though?
It's completely scary because they are not in touch. They don't know who we are, but they are part of our communities. They are our neighbors. They are brothers, sisters, uncles, mothers, and fathers. Why isn't it that the international pledge and commitment that the Namibian government has made that the internal country conversation still need to take place around this issue hasn't taken place?
I actually wanted to throw that question to Friedel, Linda, if I just may. There have been discussions on various issues, various elements, various nuances, Friedel, regarding LGBTQI plus issues, but there hasn't been a holistic national dialogue, which some people argue Namibians need to have. There's a conversation that needs to be had on a national level. Why do you think that hasn't taken place yet? Is it a political hill that we have to go over? Are some members of society also just scared to come to the party and just air their opinions? What's the actual fear around having this discussion?
Well, I think Namibia is in many ways a socially conservative country. We do not discuss things that are controversial at national level. We do not discuss sexuality. We do not discuss drug use. We do not discuss issues that are not brought on by if there is no trauma. We have only having a discussion on domestic violence, for example, because the effects of the violence are seen. We are now starting to have a discussion on insecurity and the right to remain free from violence for LGBT people because of what is happening. I believe that over the years, the only time when the LGBT issue came to the forefront was a year like this, when there are elections. And typically, what you then find is that the political class will use the fact that many Namibians are ignorant about sexuality, gender, and gender identity, to use tropes, to use stereotypes, to dehumanize because they feel that they can win votes. They feel that people will vote for them when they go out there and marginalize a section of society. We've never really seen that this tactic has worked, but we've seen that it is a tactic that has been used not just in Namibia or world over. And as you correctly point out, it's time to have that national conversation. It is time to have the conversation about minorities in Namibia, and highlight it specifically and especially highlighting the plight of LGBT people in Namibia, where we sort of expect people to be good, people to have good morals, but at the same time, Parliament will, for example, stop two people who want to go into a more permanent and more productive relationship, and raise their children, which either partner may have had or which they may have adopted in a secure family setting. We've had sort of our conversation in the country is being led by litigations of LGBT people now. LGBT people have, I know personally that over the last 20 odd years when I've been in HIV and health advocacy, we've really had this conversation with government over the last 30 years where we were saying, look at the effects of discrimination, othering, and exclusion of people. Health has come to the fore and they are now more inclusive. But what about areas in domestic violence, for example? We know, for example, that a Domestic Violence Act does not recognize two same-sex couples as a domestic relationship. And so if me and my partner, for example, are having a fight, or if I fear for my life around my partner, I'm not able to use legal instruments that could keep my partner away from coming to our home or our joint home, for example. The same policy will actually recognize that a nephew and a niece living under the same roof are a domestic relationship that need protection. Where does this come from? Does it even make sense? I think those are the kind of conversations we need to have. We know also in terms of jobs, that LGBT people are excluded. Our first labor law actually made discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation an area of prohibition. That was silently removed, and now it is uncertain because of our political class whether an LGBT person is protected, even though they are able to say at work, I'm a gay man or a lesbian woman. And so I think that this is a tragic way in which we have to start this conversation, but a conversation is really needed.
Well, one day in our conversation this particular morning with human rights activists, that's Linda Bauman and Friedel Dawson, we're speaking about the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Interphobia, and Transphobia that is today. Linda, in your final remarks, I spoke to the RDP president a few days ago, Mike Kotora, who says homosexuality is not a new thing. It's been around for a while. He said, though, that back then we coexisted and it was okay, but now it seems that issues are out in the open and that's making people uncomfortable. I'll set that as the context. We've spoken about where we've come from, we've spoken about what's happening now. How do we move forward with a political class like you and Friedel have said, that just refuses to accept that there is a minority that just wants to be treated as equally as everyone else, that there is a will from politicians who have the power to make laws, to make lives very difficult for LGBTQI plus people. How do you move forward with that Namibian context?
You see, CJ, there's one thing that a lot of people tend to question and say, what special rights do they want? There's no special rights I'm asking for. I think the first level of stock taking is that Namibia needs to acknowledge that there is progressive legislation in this country that brings equitable services for all. And that can be identified because there is legislation that Namibia, we are able to identify from a health perspective into other frameworks. But those frameworks needs to be strengthened to be able to acknowledge the diversity, and that is the core. But before we can even speak about legislative framework, that national dialogue is important for one reason for me. What will make a difference for me right now is the national recognition of the existence of LGBTI people. When any leader in this country says it, it's like what Mike just said. We've coexisted, they've always existed. But there's not been a national positioning of a leader that has power and authority to guide this country around the diversity. And that brings a problem because if there's no national recognition around it, it basically means your citizens will not even recognize the existence, which basically means that lack of recognition leads to a lack of recognition of equal rights of persons or the humanity of other people around. That is why some people feel they have the right to just touch the community or say whatever they feel like saying to us as a community. And that's no different from any marginalized community because each marginalized community carries its own struggles. But in this regard, the journey for me starts with recognition, and there's not been any Namibian leader, and I've been challenging Namibian leaders who sit in National Council, who sit in Parliament, to be able to stand up and say, these are our citizens.
Do you think they will be in the near future?
So far, nobody has had the courage to be able to say that as such. But I know there was Rosa Namises at the time when she was in COD. There were a bit of interluted opinions that came that says, let's have a conversation with all communities. The leadership has promised that dialogue, and we are asking for it. Let us sit around the table. I want the leader to tell me, Linda, my problem with you is X, Y, and Z. But the main problem that everybody has is what I do in my bedroom. As if I'm not entitled to Article 13 that speaks about my right to privacy. More so, CJ. And this is now takes me to Article 14 that speaks about the right to privacy that the current government is portraying, or leadership is portraying, that Article 14 of the Namibian Constitution that talks about the right to family, they meant a man and a woman has the right to family, while the interpretation legally says men and women of full age. Are you saying I'm not of full age? I have the right constitutionally to have my own family. And that links to what Friedel was saying about when people want to start their own families legally to be able to protect. Do you know how much we lose the days we die from these homophobes in our own family who didn't want anything to do with us, but when we die, they're at the forefront of the cups and the inheritance or whatever it is. They break a long-lasting relationship that has been more than 10 years into pieces because they felt that was not a legitimate relationship. And that is what pains us, because you are dehumanizing us. You are basically saying Article 8 of the Constitution is selective. And it's not inherent for everybody. It is for those that are heterosexual. Who says transgender people are not heterosexual? They're just born in the wrong body. Why are the heterosexual community not having their own conversation? And I think that broader conversation is important around sexuality, but also understanding the systems that influences it, but more so the ideology. Friedel said Namibia is a social conservative country. We need to unpack that conservatism with also understanding what liberalism means in the current dispensation of democracy, but also how that intersects with the current wavelength of where the country sees itself in the next 30 years. Should my children that I've raised all this year, who are so straight that people say I'm abnormal, how does that work? How can the gay child that is contributing like any straight child in the house to the pot be a problematic child, and you telling me my lifestyle is not right? I am challenging, and I'll continue to challenge, a national debate in this country. The first national debate in this country was in 1994. The last national debate in this country was in 2014 on NBC again, but then that we couldn't even access the recording of that because it was seen as a very dangerous grounds, very close to elections too. And why can't we have it? It's election year. They're used to using their tactics, so we are challenging them on their own tactic. And I'm sure Friedel is also willing to be able to advance this conversation. I'm challenging all political parties. We belong to your political parties. We are not seeking to belong to other parties. We are seeking for the actual dialogue also within political parties. So my last words, CJ, is very simple. Today, International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, is a day for reflection on creating enabling environments, but also talking about the hostilities that are being created, talking about the uncomfortable realities that we have to move through grounds. Go into a shop and you will hear somebody slurring hate words towards you. That shouldn't be what we are looking for in this country. And I think that's the dialogue that needs to be advanced at all times.
Friedel, I'll give you 20 seconds for your final words.
Yeah, thank you. So I really what I would like to impress the audience with is that it is homophobia that is the colonial import. We've had a long time that homosexuality is imported. Homosexuality and gender identities are across the world, in the smallest village, in the globe, you'll find it. What has been imported by colonialism is a codified law, like our sodomy law, that separates us. And it was actually initially designed to police black and brown colonial bodies of colonial subjects. We are now close to our election. We are now going to vote. And I think it is time that all Namibians look at who we are voting. The current crop who were in Parliament last year when the anti-gay marriage bills were debated are oath breakers. They didn't respect the checks and balances of our constitution or the separation of powers, and specifically made this bill to contradict a human rights verdict by the Supreme Court. They should all be out in the street. And I think that hopefully Namibians this time will realize their power at the ballot and make sure that we have good leaders that can remove all the stages of colonialism, including the sodomy law and homophobia, which are imports of colonialism.
That's a conversation this morning with Friedel Dausep and Linda Baumann on the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia. There's actually a story on that on page 3 of the Namibian newspaper today, which you can gladly go read on. It will cost you only $5 Namibian to do so. Friedel, Linda, it's been a pleasure being in your company. Thank you so much for your contributions this morning.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
It takes us to 8:59, and just like that, I do have to conclude and shut down the show. It's been a pleasure being with you the entire week, as well as from 6 a.m. Thank you so much for all of you that have joined us. Always appreciated. We'll be doing the exact same thing again next week from Monday. But if you want to tune in on Sunday and have, well, a slow jam session as we listen to some golden oldies, do tune in rather from 10 a.m. Until then, there's still more Desert Radio coming up. Ori will be here with the breeze around 9 o'clock. But before then, we'll give you a headlines from me, John Collin, and the entire Breakfast in the Desert team. It's cheers and have a good weekend.
When big names